Al?
Al.
Yeah.
Eldert.
You're easygoing. Eildert Zwart, who served as a pastor in the Reformed Church for many years. And beyond ministry, he is an avid history buff. He and his wife, Marietta, love traveling to historic sites. While visiting Patrick Henry's historic home, he realized that there was a lot more to Patrick Henry than what we know. Give me liberty or give me death speech, and that's what you kind of connect with Patrick Henry. But there is a lot more. He is here today to share what he has learned of this unknown patriot. So, thank you, sir.
I was greatly pleased and honored to receive the invitation to come and speak with you this afternoon.
Thank you.
And as indicated, my name is Patrick Henry, and I am your humble and obedient servant. My parents were John and Sarah Henry, and I was the second of their 10 children born in the Commonwealth of Virginia, having been born on May 29 in the year of our Lord, 1736. My father came to this country from his home in Scotland after he had completed his studies at the University of Aberdeen. I grew up and attended a neighborhood school until I was the age of 10. And then, because my parents no longer had the financial resources to send me on to college in England, my father tutored me in the classical education which he had received back in Scotland. And so under his tutorage, I studied Latin and Greek, as well as I was instructed to read from some of the classics of ancient history, people like Homer and Cicero. And then on top of that, I studied with my uncle, my namesake, whose name was the Reverend Patrick Henry, and he was a pastor in the Anglican Church not far from where we lived. And he taught me the Anglican Catechism. While I often wanted to play with my friends out of doors, I realize now that my education was a rich blessing on my life because of all that happened to me in the light of that education provided by my father and uncle. At age 14, our family moved to a farm out in the remote region in the west of Virginia, in a place called Mount Brilliant. And it was there that I remember so well the fun we had taking our canoe down the Santa Ana River. And it was interesting because every time we went, our canoe tipped over and my friends all got soaking wet. But somehow I managed to stay dry. And they began, I think, to suspect that I was having fun at their expense. Well, I was. While living there, I also became close to a wealthy neighbor named Nathaniel Dandridge. He was the largest landowner in the county. And while at his home for a Christmas party, I met not only his family, but a young fellow named Thomas Jefferson, who at the time was a 17-year-old young man. I also met his daughter, who at that time was age 4. Her name was Dorothea. I also at that party met Thomas Jefferson, as I say, and Martha Washington, because Nathaniel Dandridge was her uncle. And through that contact, I also came to know, and I am privileged to say became close and lifelong friends with George Washington, a man whom I greatly admired my whole life. Even at times when we were in disagreement, he was still a man I had great respect for, and that lasted all my life. I tell you about these things and these people because they had such a powerful impact upon making me the man and the lawyer that I have become. At the age of 15, my father wanted me to begin preparing for the responsibilities of adulthood. And so he secured for me a position as a clerk in a local store. And a year later, he provided the funds and the resources so that I and my brother William could open a store of our own and go into business for ourselves. Unfortunately, those were very difficult times in Virginia. because there was a drought beginning in 1755. And that drought again occurred the following year and in a number of the years thereafter. And after repeated periods of drought, the farmers were really struggling because they couldn't raise enough tobacco to fund their lives. Many of them were going bankrupt through that situation. And so we opened that first store, and then sometime later we opened yet another store, and I'm sorry to say that one also failed. Now, it was not because we were foolish or inept shopkeepers, but rather, as I say, it was that drought which caused so many to go bankrupt and thereby unable to repay the debts because we had extended so much credit to our good friends and neighbors who came to our store. But in the midst of those painful times, there were also joys, happy times. For in those years, I married my childhood sweetheart. Her name was Sarah Shelton, and she was the joy of my life. Our first home was at a place called Pine Slash, which was cut out of her father's plantation. He gave us 300 acres of land taken from one edge of his total plantation. We were so happy having a place to live and a farm to work, but unfortunately we discovered that the soil of that farm was very poor. And therefore, no matter how long I worked, how hard I worked, the crops were too small and we just could hardly survive. And finally, I continued working the farm for a number of years, but about 3 years into our stay in that home, our house burned to the ground. And so, having no place to live, we moved into the overseer's cottage, from which had once been a part of the larger plantation. And we lived there for about 6 months. It was about 100 yards from where our original home had been. And finally, after some months living there, I continued to work, as I say, but we moved into the Hanover Tavern, which was owned by my wife's father. And in order to pay for our boarding there and our other expenses, I began to work with him, and I waited on tables as well as doing other chores around the tavern, which was probably what you would understand to be an inn. It was right alongside the main road between Richmond and towns to the north. And so we had a lot of travelers, and the county courthouse, probably the biggest one in the Commonwealth, was just directly across the road. So it was a place where a lot of people passed by, but also stopped and stayed because of trials that were going on at the court. Well, at any rate, as I say, I worked there, and the more I had opportunity to mingle among the customers, many of whom were judges and lawyers, and often I would overhear them discussing trials and cases that were being tried across the street in the courthouse. And the more I listened, the more I began to wonder and think that maybe I should consider a career in the law as my life's profession. Well, in 1758, I began to read whatever law books I could borrow, so that finally in 1760, I decided to go to Williamsburg, the capital, and there submit an application to become a lawyer. Now, back in that day, there was not such an easy process. You could, I suppose, go to school, but couldn't afford that, and there were no law schools at all in the colonies. And so I had to find a mentor, some well-respected lawyer who would be willing to take me on and teach me the law so that then I could ultimately take and hopefully pass the exam to become an official lawyer. Well, no one was willing to accept me and take on that task. And part of it was, I suppose, because they assumed that I was just a country bumpkin looking for a quick way to get rich. And they weren't willing to take that on. Because you see, when I came to them, I wasn't dressed in the finery of many of the wealthy young men who sought a career in the law. I was dressed in the handmade rough clothing of a country boy. And that probably turned them off somewhat. But they also wondered about my ability to handle that kind of training. Surprisingly, it was a young man named Thomas Jefferson who I had met, remember, back at the Dandridge home at a Christmas party. He had connections, and through his connections, he managed to get me in contact with a well-respected lawyer who then agreed, through his influence, to take me on. And then he ultimately signed my application, did some mentoring with me, and then I took the exam and passed the bar, received my license. In 17 and 60, near the end of that year, after I had finished that training, I began to work as a lawyer in many of the small county courthouses in the surrounding areas. On December 1, in the year 17 and 63, I stepped into the political arena for the very first time. The occasion was a lawsuit brought in Hanover County by the Reverend James Maury, who wanted to receive the salary, the back pay that he believed he was due. And so he sought through the courts to gain that salary which had not been paid, at least in full. And so the law allowed at that time a new law passed by the legislature called the Two-Penny Act, which allowed for the first time farmers and businessmen to pay in cash, especially farmers, to pay in cash rather than in pounds of tobacco. Because you see, the price of tobacco goes up and down, but the government in Virginia was setting a standard pay. But the pastors didn't like that new law, and they did everything possible in Virginia to try and get it repealed. When they weren't successful, they decided to contact some of their friends who they had gotten to know and were supportive of them in London. And so they contacted lawyers in London who brought that case to the Parliament and ultimately before the king. And after some time, the king decided that the pastors should be paid. And so it was brought back to the states. Well, because the king had made this ruling, there wasn't a single well-known, well-respected lawyer who wanted to even touch that case. Because why would anyone who has a great reputation want to lose a case that the king has already decided, decreeing that the pastors must be paid? And they wanted to be paid that full amount of the tobacco, which would have meant a 3 times bigger salary than they normally would have received. And so it just seemed like a hopeless case, and no one was willing to take it on because it seemed like it was something no one could win, especially since the pastors didn't have to be, they knew they had to be paid, but no decree had been made as to how much. And so it seemed like a minor trial in some ways. Well, I rose at that trial to begin my speech. And I did so not by focusing on the amount that the pastors should receive, but on a whole different topic. I talked about what I believed the king had, and his disregard for the legislature there in Virginia, the House of Burgesses. And because he had made a decree which overruled the decision which our Burgesses had made, it seemed he had a total disregard for us, his colonists. And so it was a challenge between the king's authority as opposed to the rights and liberties of we, his colonists. Although I had never left, I'm sorry, let me back up. What I didn't really think about at the time, because I was so focused on the subject of the trial, was that I was bringing to light what more and more became the irreconcilable conflict between the king and his subjects here in the colonies. You might say that I was planting the seed which ultimately led us to declare our independence from England. Although I personally never left the Anglican Church, I also scolded the priests for coming with this trial, with this lawsuit. And I even called them so much as the enemies of the community, because I was convinced that they were more concerned about their personal gain than they were about the pressing needs of their parishioners, especially those who were farmers among us. The day of the trial, the courthouse was filled. Every seat was taken, and everyone there had strong feelings about what was about to happen. There were the hopeful pastors that would be told finally they would receive the large salary that they were seeking. On the other hand, there were the farmers and the citizens who were hopeful that the judgment would be in their favor. And so perhaps I should tell you too that the judge who was presiding over the trial was my own father, Judge John Henry, which also added a new dynamic to what was happening that day. But anyway, when the jury came back, and by the way, they only deliberated for about 5 minutes, an extremely short time for the jury to go out and come back in. But when they came back in, they said, the pastors must be paid. But, and when they said their next few words, the courthouse exploded with excitement because they announced that the pastors should be paid 1 penny, far less than they had originally been receiving. And so the people were joyous and the pastors were disgusted. In fact, Pastor Murray called me an upstart, as well as some other names I will not mention in public. But at any rate, at that moment then the people in the courtroom picked me up, put me on their shoulders, and they carried me out into the community with great joy and rejoicing. Moments later, as I say, they carried me out, and from that moment on, my reputation as a lawyer, my popularity began to grow, although that was never my concern. When I agreed to serve as the lawyer in the Parsons cause, I did so not because I wanted to seek fame or recognition, because remember, this was a trial nobody wanted to take on. There was great fear that one would be put to shame because you couldn't win this kind of case. But anyway, when I took it on, I did so because of the needs of my family. I had to have the work in order to make some money. I must admit that I am also both pleased and, I admit, a little embarrassed when I think back on the sort of theatrical tactics which I used while addressing the jury. Perhaps I should explain to you why I used that word theatrical. And I did it because as a child, I had gone to church with my mother, who had left the Anglican Church and had begun worshiping at one of the illegal Presbyterian churches, where she heard much more emotional and powerful preaching than she did in her former church. As a child, I often went to church with my mom, and I came under that influential preaching, especially of the Reverend Samuel Davies, who was considered one of the greatest preachers of his day. In his sermons, I gained not only a better understanding of the Christian faith, but I also observed him and the way he spoke and preached. He had a powerful voice and a powerful style, a very persuasive style. And he used a lot of different tactics to engage his congregation as he was preaching to them. And so when I came to speak that day in the Hanover courthouse, I didn't try to overwhelm the jury with arguments about the rightness of the Virginia law, the Two-Penny Act. I didn't spend time on that. I also didn't plead with the jury, try to get their sympathy going for those poor farmers who were struggling and couldn't get enough money hardly to live. And so when I began to speak, I didn't say a word. I said I began to speak. I really didn't begin to speak right away. I stepped forward before the jury, and I lifted my eyes to the ceiling, and I just stood there looking at the ceiling, as though I was looking up to heaven and praying for God's help and guidance. Again, not saying a word. And finally then, I looked down at the floor, and I stood there again in silence. You see, I had learned from Reverend Davies that silence can be a powerful tool. It can make the people who are listening become eager, focusing in and thinking, what's going on? Is he so timid, so inexperienced in this large courtroom that he's afraid even to open his mouth? I can imagine my father was beginning to sweat and worry about what was going on in the mind of his son, and would I ever begin to defend the Parsons? And so I looked at the floor for a long time. And then finally, when I thought the crowd and the jury especially were ready to listen to me, that's when I began to speak. Well, as you know, I won that case. In the years that followed, I worked as a lawyer in many of the small courtrooms that surrounded where I lived. As my financial situation began to improve, I also purchased a large and lovely home at a place called Scotchtown. I bought it because my wife was beginning to experience some severe depression and maybe even mental illness. And I hoped that this would be a place of peace and hopefully even more so a place of healing for my dear wife, Sarah. Sadly, those years were not only filled with concerns and troubles at home because of her condition, but also within our country. The tension between Great Britain and the colonies just grew and grew. It seemed like every day there was news about something happening which made the tensions between us and England all the stronger. The next major event in my career came 2 years later, in the year 1765, when the anger of the colonists was aroused by a new law imposed by the British called the Stamp Act. This was another attempt by Parliament to raise some money through taxes on all of us. And they put the tax on all commercial and legal papers, so that every paper we wanted to sign or use, whether it was a legal document, a newspaper, playing cards, an almanac, and so many other things, everything with paper had to be taxed, and we had to put a stamp on it. And so this caused a great deal of riot and problem. This followed only a couple of years after the Sugar Act, which had been a tax on sugar. And of course, the colonists didn't want to pay that tax, so they just began to live without sugar and refused to buy it. And so that tax completely failed. But Sir George Grenville, the Chancellor of the Exchequer in England, had decided that this might be a good way to get tax money from the colonies to pay the debts which England had incurred when they sent all those soldiers over to the colonies to help us fight the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, as it's also called. Well, that tax didn't work so well either, because we as colonists refused to pay for those stamps. We refused to buy them. Sometimes there were stamp burning situations, and then there were also times of great intimidation for those people who had been hired to sell the stamps. They were so intimidated, they would constantly be resigning, they'd have to hire new people, and that tax never worked either. And so the colonists were demanding our rights as Englishmen to be taxed only by our own consent. It's how the phrase came to be in use: no taxation without representation. Well, a little later, about that time, I won a seat as one of the burgesses in the House of Burgesses, also in 1765. And I began my career just as that news of the stamp tax was coming to us from England. And so I, along with many other members of the Burgesses' House, stood in opposition and spoke out against it. By a narrow margin, on May 29 and 30 of that year, 1765, I had come with a series of resolutions, of proposals that I wanted the House to vote on. And it was all those resolutions that then began to create a great deal of animosity there in the House. And as a matter of fact, that animosity is somewhat seen in the picture before you. This is a painting by Peter Rothmel, probably one of the most famous paintings of me, and it depicts the anger that was in the minds of some who heard me speaking. Because I had brought 7 resolutions, and I actually presented only 5, because I realized that the last 2 were much stronger and would probably be rejected anyway. But in God's providence, 5 of my resolutions were not unanimously, not immediately, but they were passed. And so we rejected the king's authority concerning our taxation. But as I was presenting that, I also talked about some of the things that had happened in history. And particularly when I mentioned, or reminded the body, of the fact that King Charles I, a predecessor of King George, when King Charles I had refused to make changes, refused to care for the people of England in the way that people thought was proper, a man named Oliver Cromwell came and with an army ultimately threw him from the throne, and ultimately King Charles was executed. And so when I mentioned King Charles and Oliver Cromwell, the Tories, the British loyalists in the House, went into an uproar. And all over the House there were people shouting, "Treason! Treason!" And that caused a great stir. I don't remember what I said in the emotion of that moment, but my friends tell me that I turned to them and I said, "If this be treason, make the most of it." And it was a brutal time in my early career. You see, the crown was in competition with the colonies. Now, when tension between England and the colonies increased over the next few years, and I was always trying to balance the needs of my growing family with all the demands of my increasing law practice. After nearly a decade of trials in small county courts, I was finally granted permission to serve as a lawyer in a trial at the General Court, which was the highest court within the county. Our relationship, as I say, with England grew more and more strained. And in 1770, there occurred in Boston what was called the Boston Massacre. It was a horrible event in which some of the citizens of Boston, mostly unarmed citizens, were killed by British soldiers and created a huge stir for many, many months. And then only 2 years later, in 1773, we received news of another protest in Boston called the Boston Tea Party. In December of that year, that Boston Tea Party took place, where tons of tea was cast into the harbor, again creating great anger in England. Well, these events led Parliament to enact yet another law. They called it the Coercive Acts. We refer to it as the Intolerable Acts. And the reason for that is because they closed the port of Boston to all trade, thereby preventing all the people of Boston from getting many of the supplies from other places that they needed and wanted. There was no traffic in the harbor because the British had closed it tight. On top of that, and even worse, they were decreed that all those British soldiers that they had now brought over because of the increasing tensions, those soldiers had to be housed in our own houses. And that really set off the colonists, not only in Boston, but all over the 13 colonies. At that point, I was also a delegate to the Continental Congress meeting in Philadelphia. And at that point, I stood and said that the old boundaries that existed between us and England and between us as separate colonies, they were disappearing. One of the things I had started was called the Committee of Communication. And so for the first time, we as colonies were contacting each other with letters back and forth, letting each of the colonies know what was happening in our area so that they could join with us and understand the plight that we faced. And so because of that greater communication, we also began to send even more letters and petitions to the king. And then we waited and waited, sometimes weeks, sometimes even months. When our petitions were finally answered, at first reading they sounded so sweet and sympathetic. But as we thought about the answer, we realized there was a stern and rigid stance being taken by England They refused to even consider the petitions and the things that we were asking for. Well, in the